Hey, Laura Rice here. We're trying to improve the Texas Standard podcast experience, and we want to know what you think. If you have a minute, could you please fill out our podcast survey at texasstandard.org/survey? You can also find a link in the description. And thanks.
How does disability affect millions of Texans from public policy to long COVID? We explore the state of disability in Texas today on the Texas Standard.
Texas Standard is a production of KUT Austin, KERA North Texas, Houston Public Media, and Texas Public Radio in San Antonio.
I'm Shelley Brisbane. It's a population that's often overlooked and underestimated. People living with disabilities play a wide variety of roles in the life of modern Texas. They're living full lives, advocating for better caregiving options, inclusive transportation, and voting accessibility. And many participate in the vibrant arts and culture of our state. We hear from advocates working to make a difference. Our special edition of the Texas Standard gets underway right after this. From the farmlands of North and South Texas to the high rises of Dallas and Houston, from the performance stages of Austin to the beautiful vistas of Big Bend, the Lone Star State is a tapestry of human endeavor and ability. I'm Shelley Brisbane, and this is a special edition of Texas Standard, the state of disability in Texas. Sometimes we say it with statistics. 1/4 of Americans, many millions of Texans, live with a disability. And sometimes we seek to tug at heartstrings, telling stories of overcoming obstacles, of the inspiration that we gain from learning about someone else's experience. Some people live with disabilities their whole lives. Others find themselves navigating life differently after illness or injury. Encompassing the wide array of these experiences in just one program would be impossible. But that's why we're treating this special as a kickoff of Texas Standard's year-long commitment to featuring the voices of and covering the topics important to disabled Texans. On today's program, we'll hear stories about the impact of disability on Texans, from caregiving and transportation to inclusive arts and culture, and how long COVID has morphed into a disability for some of those who experience it. And many of the voices you'll hear belong to people who live with disabilities, telling their own stories of the work they do and the vibrant lives they live. We begin with public policy. How does the state of Texas respond to its citizens with disabilities? During every legislative session, bills are filed that would make a difference for Texans with disabilities. In 2023, lawmakers passed a bill that require residential facilities receiving Medicaid funds to do criminal background checks before hiring staff. The goal is to protect residents, including individuals with developmental disabilities. Other bills did not make it through the process, including one that was vetoed by Governor Greg Abbott. It would have established an accessible absentee voting system in the state. To help us parse through the impact of recent legislative actions in Texas, we're speaking with 3 people who work in the trenches when it comes to public policy affecting Texans with disabilities. Amy Litziger directs the advocacy staff at Texas Parent to Parent, an organization that helps improve the lives of children living with disability. Amy, welcome.
Thank you.
Chase Bearden is Deputy Executive Director of the Coalition of Texans with Disabilities. Chase, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
And last but not least, Lauren Gherkin is a policy analyst for the Texas Coalition of Developmental Disabilities. Lauren, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with a very broad question. Over the last decade or so, the legal landscape for Texans has changed when it comes to disability. Have things generally been getting better or worse for people with disabilities in the state? Chase, let's start with you.
I think all in all, we've had an uptick of trying to improve different areas, and we're slowly getting there, but every legislative session or as technology changes, we're facing new barriers in the workplace and in the community. So I think it's an ever-changing landscape, but I think we're seeing more people in the disability community doing more and able to, based off of a lot of the protections and services that we've put out there over the years.
Lauren, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I agree. I'm a big believer that, that our progress is slow but moving. we've seen some improvement in terms of guardianship policy incident in Texas for people with disabilities. We've seen an increase in general awareness of disability issues in policy and a greater understanding of how people with disabilities are affected, and that they are an important part of the fabric of our society, and that we have to really focus on improving inclusion and moving forward. We are not going away, so we have to integrate us better.
Amy, what's your take on that? Do you feel like things are improving generally?
From a policy perspective, yeah, we are making progress. But because not only are we all policy people in the disability arena, we're all people with disabilities. So sometimes it feels like, yeah, the policy's improving, but the boots on the ground, I actually have to live with my disability and the consequences of the policy that may not change as fast as I need them to day to day. So, yeah, things are improving, but we need to make sure that they're not just improving on a philosophical level, that we actually see, what does this look like in people's daily life, which I think we're not seeing enough of.
I wonder, as somebody who's both an advocate and a person with a disability, if you feel like those dual identities make it easier for you to be an advocate and to explain to people who might not understand the sort of details of public policy you're working on. I mean, does it help?
It helps from the policy side because I can use my own life as an example, but it doesn't help from a person with a disability side sometimes, because I feel like I know too much for my own good, and I know exactly why I'm not getting the supports I need, and it feels like it's my job to fix it by myself.
Let's talk about the legislative session in 2023. Are there any particular big wins or frustrations that you had this session? Amy, let's start with you.
Education had several big losses with the idea of vouchers. We're worried that special ed funding is going to be taken away to fund the vouchers so that there's less money for school districts to work with in their special education budget. And anecdotally from our members, we've heard that if they go to a charter school or a non-public school, it only works for a while because IDEA is not followed, and then a couple months later they have to go back into the public schools anyway, but the public school has already lost the funding that was used in the vouchers.
For folks who don't know, can you briefly explain what IDEA is?
IDEA is the anti-discrimination law that allows students to access special education services.
And that's at the federal level, yes?
Yes.
Chase, how about you? Victories the legislative session this time, or frustrations that you experienced?
I think I would throw out there both a victory and a real frustration. And you talked about this in the opening. A lot of the work we did was around elections, and I think passing HB 3159, which would have made an accessible mail-in ballot for people with disabilities, especially those who are visually impaired or have upper body extremity loss, to be able to cast a mail-in ballot independently has taken a lot of years and a lot of sessions to really explain to people and work through. And the reason I say it was a win is that we were able to get bipartisan support across the board. I believe there was only 5 legislators who voted against it. And when do you get that in a voting bill? And it was something that we really worked hard with the Secretary of State's office, with all of the legislators. The disappointment came on the last day of vetoes when the bill was vetoed, and no one was really given a heads up. And our hope is that we can continue working with the governor and that his comments that he believed it was a good bill and that we just need to make some adjustments and that it will come up in a special session. At the end of the day, that was a big win just to get the acknowledgement from all the legislators that it was the right thing to do and from the Secretary of State's office.
Lauren, what's your perspective on the legislative session?
So, we also saw some wins and some setbacks. I think that is pretty normal in a legislative session. We have been looking at the issue of parents of children with disabilities who are unable to find a daycare facility in their area that will accept children with disabilities as a blanket statement without really doing an in-depth analysis of what accommodations that child may or may not need. And we had a bill in session, in last session, and the session before that would really address that issue by ensuring that licensed child care facilities in Texas understood that they're not permitted to discriminate based on disability. That bill in the past had not made it out of the committee that it was in, and this session it did make it through the committee, and it made it to the House floor, and it got voted through the House. The legislation, as it's currently written, will get filed that way next session and will already be set up in a better position than it was at the end of this session.
This is a special edition of the Texas Standard, the state of disability in Texas. I'm Shelley Brisbane. So far in our program, we've been hearing about the legal landscape and top issues addressed or ignored in this past legislative session. Still ahead, we'll turn our focus to the future and which areas advocates see as needing the most attention in the years to come. Plus, we'll shift gears and hear about the efforts of one Texas university to try and get the siblings of people with autism more involved in care early in life. And a reminder that this program is just the kickoff of a year-long effort by Texas Standard to center the experiences of the estimated 1 in 5 Texans who experiences some sort of disability. And we want to hear from you. You can share your stories and reactions to what you've heard on social media, or leave us a message via the Contact Us page at texasstandard.org. More just ahead.
Support for Texas Standard comes from BarbaQuest, an original series by the beef-loving Texans at the Texas Beef Council. Barbecue recipes and new episodes now streaming at beeflovingtexans.com.
You're listening to a special edition of the Texas Standard, the state of disability in Texas. I'm Shelley Brisbane. We are neighbors, friends, your families. In a state filled with opportunities and challenges, how do disabled Texans build lives of independence and dignity? It's a question we've been asking 3 disability advocates through the lens of what happened in the most recent Texas legislative session. Now we'll take that question forward. What will become the next big policy priorities? Amy Litzinger directs the advocacy staff at Texas Parent to Parent. Chase Bearden is Deputy Executive Director for the Coalition of Texans with Disabilities. Lauren Gerken is Policy Analyst for the Texas Council for Developmental Disabilities. I was curious to hear from all our guests about their priorities for the future.
I am really worried about this attendant wage situation because it used to be that this was a competitive wage, but we haven't had a cost of living increase for as long as I've had services, and I've had them half my life. So instead of this being a good entry-level job, we're now $5 lower than most fast food restaurants. But the other thing is the waiting list is almost a lifetime long at this point. But we need to do both of them together, because if we reduce the waiting list and then they can't fill any of the positions, we have a problem. But if we increase the wages and we still have 160,000 people who can't even access anything, that's a problem too.
Attendant care is one of the key ones that all of our members always talk about. We'll continue working on elections and making sure we remove barriers and make sure there aren't new ones being put in place. And then just working from there on any other area where access can be improved so that people with disabilities can just live as full of a life as they want to.
One of our priorities, looking at Medicaid income limits. So when people have Medicaid and are on a Medicaid waiver, they have an income limit that is adjacent to supplemental security income. And that is a pretty low number, and we have seen instances where a person receiving Medicaid services, which often is crucial to getting up and getting out of bed and actually getting to work in the morning, ends up earning a little bit over that income limit, and they lose their Medicaid. And it sets them back because they then lose their insurances that are helping them maintain employment. So they lose their insurances, and they oftentimes lose their employment at the same time. So we are really interested in exploring what are the options for navigating that income limit, maybe having some kind of forgiveness system where people can maintain their waiver and pay money back, or better yet, increasing that income limit to respect the fact that people with disabilities want to and can have competitive integrated employment, but that does not mean they no longer need Medicaid services, which are often not provided in the health insurance that employers provide.
We've been speaking with Amy Litzinger from Texas Parent to Parent, Chase Bearden with the Coalition of Texans with Disabilities, and Lauren Gerken of the Texas Council on Developmental Disabilities. Amy, Chase, Lauren, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Support for Coverage of Business comes from Texas Mutual, a workers' compensation insurance company committed to providing support to nonprofits, bringing positive change to working families and Texas communities. More at texasmutual.com/community.
And you're listening to the Texas Standard. Many Texans with disabilities live independently. Others may need assistance with errands or self-care. Still others rely heavily on family or other caretakers. Parents are often the go-to caregivers for their children, but for those who may need lifelong assistance, there can be a question of who takes over in later years. The Texas Standard's Gloria Martinez takes a look at a new program that aims to offer an answer for some.
At Baylor University in Waco, researchers are breaking new ground in autism treatment with a program that centers around sibling relationships.
Siblings sometimes aren't noticed as much as other family members, so parent training is very important, but we often leave behind siblings who are going to be lifelong comrades of their sibling with autism.
That's Jessica Akers. She's an assistant professor of educational psychology at Baylor. This past April, she launched a unique treatment model called the Sibling Success Program.
Siblings have a really unique perspective on their sibling with autism. Like their parents will come and ask them, like, what's he saying right now? And they know because they have a much closer bond in that way.
Akers has her own siblings on the autism spectrum.
You'll have siblings that have shared games that maybe they only play. For example, I had like a version of tag that I played with my brother David, and no one else did, but we had that shared experience. So I think that's a special relationship that you can tap into.
Tap into when it comes to getting involved in care.
Because often siblings get included once they have to be included. So once a parent passes away and then they're the only one there, which a lot of siblings feel like something gets dumped in their lap and they had no idea how to navigate the service providers or any of the systems.
So one big part of the Sibling Success Program is to start those conversations sooner.
If you include them earlier, they're already going to have those skills. And also, siblings are usually really good advocates for their sibling with autism.
Right now, some siblings actually feel excluded from caregiving. Baylor accounting grad student Jade Van Wyck grew up with a sibling with autism. She's now the president of a group called Bears Autism Spectrum Society on campus.
When someone would come to our house to do therapy or just help her, it was like, okay, now you have to go to another room and I need to work with your sister.
The Sibling Success Program offers 3 levels of treatment, from long-term programs to one-day workshops. All are focused on children with autism aged 5 through 18 and their siblings. Not just the facts of care, but also teaching siblings to form healthy relationships with each other.
We also interviewed the siblings and asked them things like, what is your brother really good at that no one knows about? Or what's something you wish you could do with him, but you can't right now? We write goals that are specific to the siblings playing together, maybe requesting things from their sibling instead of grabbing things.
The program also provides space for non-autistic siblings to meet others with similar life experiences. For people like Van Wyck, it's a rare opportunity to receive peer support and validation.
There might be people that know about autism or that have had experiences with people on the spectrum, but it's always different to meet a sibling who was raised alongside someone with autism. It's just a totally different experience. You don't feel weird mentioning things, or you don't feel like someone is going to pity you or think you had a weird life.
Van Wyck knows there's no one-size-fits-all approach for families with autism. Still, she thinks Acres is on the right track by acknowledging the importance of sibling bonds.
I think it's really beneficial to have that sibling's input, not to put all the burden on the sibling and not to make them a teacher, but as long as they're willing, it would still be helpful to teach them how to navigate that.
Over the next 3 years, the Sibling Success Team hopes to work with 125 families across Central Texas. You can find out more about the program and how to get involved at texasstandard.org. This is Glory Martinez for the Texas Standard.
You're listening to a special edition of the Texas Standard, the State of Disability in Texas. I'm Shelley Brisbane. There's a woman in the Texas Hill Country with a dog. Together they go on public speaking engagements and run a nonprofit. They've also starred in Emmy Award-winning videos. Texas Public Radio's Jack Morgan has the story.
Emma Faye Rudkin lost her hearing during childhood. She learned sign language, how to read someone's lips as they spoke, and how to use her own voice. It wasn't easy.
Years of therapy and speech therapy, and I do actually use sign language now as an adult.
But Rudkin didn't stop with her own life. She now runs Aid the Silent, a nonprofit that advocates for the hearing impaired. Rudkin teamed up with KLRN, San Antonio's PBS affiliate, to produce 1-minute videos that offer important life lessons to young people.
It's really targeted the ages 4 to 8. But I've had several people who are adults message me and say how much it meant to hear that perspective.
Katrina Kehoe is KLRN's vice president for marketing.
Whether it's please or thank you or love or sharing, she teaches them what the word is. She teaches how to sign the word, and then she uses it in a few sentences and talks about how it's important to be that word, to be kind, to be loving, to share.
Hi, boys and girls. I'm Emma Faye, and this is Hank the hearing dog. Are you ready to learn how to sign a new word today?
Rudkin says learning to sign even just a few words can produce empathy, even in those who can hear. Rudkin also speaks at conventions across the U.S.
I speak a lot for my job. So I'm actually a public speaker for education and some different conferences.
A few years ago, Rudkin stepped on a light rail track without realizing a train was coming into the station. Someone pulled her back onto the platform and saved her life. She had always taken pride in her professional independence, but she swallowed that pride and applied to get a service dog to help her navigate daily life. That's how she met Hank. Hank has also come to play a more important role in her work with helping kids better understand one another.
A lot of my job is going to schools, and I teach against anti-bullying, how to be kind. If you met someone with a disability, how do you interact with them? How do you play with them?
Rudkin relies on her own experiences to help today's young people. She says her parents taught her how to face and overcome her fears, and they used her love for horses to instill that wisdom.
My dad had a rule. He said the only way you can keep the horse is if every time you get bucked off, you immediately get back on the horse. Because something happens, the longer you let fear rule that situation, the more you become afraid of something you once loved.
I'm Jack Morgan in San Antonio.
In car-loving Texas, driving from place to place is almost a foregone conclusion for the majority of Texans. But for those living with disabilities, getting around can be a challenge if driving isn't an option. That's especially true outside the state's major population centers. The Texas Standard's Alexa Hart wanted to find out more about the barriers to transportation access and how we can make them lower. Alexa, welcome.
Hey, Shelley. Good to speak with you.
I understand you wanted to look into transportation access and after getting some feedback from a listener.
Yeah, that's right. So after my story for our Pumped special earlier this year about car dependency in Texas, we had a listener reach out asking us to talk a bit about the ways that lack of transit accessibility can make things challenging for people with disabilities. And I had a conversation with this listener. Her name is Barbara Spear, and she shared some firsthand experience with me on the challenges of navigating a rural area with a visual impairment.
What does she have to say?
So Barbara's a retired school teacher living in a small town in South Texas, which means that there are even fewer transportation options than living in a city with public transportation and paratransit. So she told me that sometimes she uses county call-in services that can come pick her up, but those carry a lot of fees and they add up fast. And she brought up a good point about affordability of those services.
The service becomes unaffordable for a group of people who are vastly underhired. So our income has a direct impact on where we can go.
And since people with disabilities face a lot of job discrimination, they may not be able to afford all these fees for the transit services, which in turn limits where they can travel, which limits job opportunities even further.
Yeah, so that creates a vicious cycle. So how does she get around?
So Barbara told me that she relies mostly on her husband, who is sighted, and then she also walks some places. But of course, small towns don't really have much walkability. And that brings up another point. It's dangerous out there for pedestrians, and it's dangerous even if you don't have a disability. So of course, even more so if you do. And Barbara told me a few years ago, she went to San Antonio to do some training to get a guide dog. And she was at an intersection with the talking walk signals that, tell you when it's time to cross the street. And it was her turn to cross.
And I was about a lane and a half out into the street when the mobility instructor yelled at me to stop, and she grabbed me by the shoulder and pulled me back because this truck went right in front of me and almost hit me.
So even in cities that are more navigable than rural areas, you still have these things you have to look out for, right?
Yeah, that's a real challenge because drivers don't always obey the rules that pedestrians were taught.
Exactly.
So in big cities like Austin, there are buses and paratransit systems, but those are really imperfect systems.
Exactly. So I spoke with Virginia Dyes. She's the program director at U.S. Aging and co-director of the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center. And she said one of the biggest issues when it comes to transit services, whether it's public transit or paratransit options, specifically for people with disabilities, is availability. So while there may be good schedules during the weekdays, other times it can be harder to access, which is especially a problem if you have a disability that requires frequent treatments or therapies.
But if you have a mid-afternoon doctor's appointment, can you get home using the service that's available? And frequently there's no service on weekends. And we know that a lot of people, particularly dialysis patients, get dialysis on Saturdays.
And some of those paratransit services require you to call ahead and make appointments days or weeks even in advance. So it requires a lot of planning and, mental effort and foresight, and not to mention those fees I've talked about before. So, and then for buses and such, getting between stops can be a challenge. For example, if you're in a wheelchair and the sidewalks aren't well maintained, if they even exist at all.
What other kind of barriers are out there?
Sure. So Virginia told me that a big part of the equation is just awareness of the options that are out there. And this is especially important for people who are newly disabled, or maybe they are like temporarily disabled.
So a lot of older adults with disabilities may not apply because they don't necessarily recognize themselves as having a disability. And also a lot of people just simply don't know about the service, especially if they previously drove a car.
And so maybe they're spending a lot of money on Ubers and Lyfts when they could be qualifying for these paratransit services or discounted bus fares and not even know it.
Where can people find out more about these services if they feel like they would benefit from them or a loved one might?
Yes, you can call 211, which can direct you towards your local agencies, city and county agencies that provide disability services, or the Administration for Community Living has a disability information and access line, DIAL. More information on that can be found at acl.gov/dial, DIAL. And additionally, they have an elder care locator at eldercare.acl.gov.
And of course, we'll have links to all these services and more at texasstandard.org. Alexa Hart is a reporter and producer for The Standard. Alexa, thanks.
Thank you.
Support for Texas Standard comes from Enel North America, generating renewable energy with projects run by and for Texans, investing in the future of local communities, schools, and small businesses. Learn more at enelnorthamerica.com/Texas.
You're tuned to a special edition of the Texas Standard, the State of Disability in Texas. I'm Shelley Brisbane.
My heart pounded as I looked at the trees to the left and right of us. I shuddered as we passed an old tree. It was bent over in a funny way that made it look like a crooked old man begging for help with his falling apart arms. And his mouth was all zigzaggy, looking suspiciously miserable. He probably had some kind of disease that he really just wanted to get other people sick with. That's ridiculous. More like it got struck by lightning, so it looks like a screaming mouth and a crooked back, I thought. My name is Holly Foster. I live with my family in San Antonio, Texas. And I'm 10 years old, and I like reading, and I have a pet bird. When I was younger, I still read a lot of books, but eventually I decided I wanted to write my own book, so I wrote a book called Camp Misty Woods, and it's, I think, somewhere around 35,000 words long. And it's about 4 kids who go to a camp with horses, and they find friendship and adventure. It makes me feel happy because I had always wanted to write a book, and then everybody liked it. I had a book signing at school. They did like posters and they sent out flyers for my book. I can't walk like other kids, so I found other things to do like reading and drawing. And when I'm reading, I feel like I get to be in another world for a little bit. I want people to know that even though we can't do, like, some things other people can't do, we're still very capable and we can still do great things that other people can do. I'm Holly Foster, I'm 10 years old, and you're listening to the Texas Standard.
Some accessibility challenges have obvious solutions. Replace stairs with a ramp. Offer closed captioning on a TV show. Others are more complicated, though. Like, how do you make visual art accessible to people who are blind or have a visual impairment, especially when there are few verbal cues to build around? The Texas Standard's Michael Marks went looking for answers.
This is what you hear at the start of the movie E.T. the Extraterrestrial. For about the first 8 minutes, there's just music, no dialogue. But there's also important stuff happening on the screen. stuff you need to know to follow the plot of the movie, like E.T. getting left behind on Earth.
The first actual dialogue are the kids sitting around the table in the kitchen of their house. So a person who is blind has to spend the rest of the movie trying to figure out what is the purpose of the movie.
That's Celia Hughes, Executive Director of ArtSpark Texas, which is based in Austin and produces art programs for underserved communities around the state. She's also experienced in audio description. Audio describers relate key visual information so visually impaired members of an audience can follow what's going on in a show, movie, or any other medium that relies on an ability to see.
So through audio description, you describe that whole opening sequence. So the person who is blind has an equitable experience. They know exactly what's happening when the dialogue begins in the kitchen.
For a long time, describers were taught to keep a neutral tone. No opinions, no editorializing, just the facts. That is starting to change, though, especially in audio description for dance.
One of the reasons that's happening is because we have blind dancers who are now involved in audio description, because they're like, no, this hasn't been a good experience for me, let's make it better. From that is coming this whole new notion of what is the emotion of the story.
Kayla Hamilton is one of the people pushing this transition. She's a dancer and an educator originally from Texarkana, who now lives in the Bronx. Hamilton is visually impaired herself and develops dances and description in tandem.
I want to know what's happening. I want to know what's happening with like specific body parts, basically, like what's going on. I care about the races of the people. I care about the body types of the people. Anything that can give me like political information, I want to know about.
In a piece called Unearthing the Dark, Hamilton performed the same movements over and over again, with different descriptions playing for the audience. Some were clinical, almost robotic.
Backwards leaps, arms windmill backwards, sternum reaches up.
Others had nearly no description of the action, just feeling.
Right now, up, a little floor motion, boom, 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 boom.
For Hamilton, audio description is flexible.
Maybe in this one particular section, it's super important to know exactly what the body is doing. But another place, I can give a little bit more like context or feeling. And I also think feeling can come through like in the way that the description is being delivered, using like tone.
Some dances are more straightforward to describe than others. A modern abstract piece can present challenges that something with a clear story may not. A big ensemble number is more complicated than a solo. For any performance, though, getting as much practice as possible is always preferable.
The more that I previewed it, the easier that it is, because I know what's coming. But then if I have to describe it the first time, that's the first time I'm saying any of these things, right? And it's coming right off the top of my head. If I do it a second time or a third time, like, it would get easier every time.
That's the voice of Allison Tigner, an audio describer from Houston. I recently watched her describe a dress rehearsal of Peter and Wendy, a show based on Peter Pan put on by Houston's Open Dance Project. The stage at Miller Outdoor Theater looks out on this big open space with seats and a lawn, but Tigner and I are scrunched together in a cramped soundproof box behind all the seats, with an air conditioner blasting behind us. During the show, Tigner talks into a microphone that broadcasts to headsets the venue provides to visually impaired folks. Someone else coordinates that because if there's a technical problem, Tigner can't stop describing in the middle of a show to deal with it. She has to be totally locked in to what's happening on stage.
So I'm having to be engaged in the same way that I would be in a conversation. I might only be talking, but then I'm waiting for them to give me information, and then I'm talking and then I take information, and then I'm talking and I take information.
Before the show starts, audio describers generally read pre-show notes that give the audience a preview of the characters, their costumes, the set, and other visual details. Once the rehearsal begins, the music comes through a scratchy little speaker in the soundproof room. Except for entrances and exits, Tigner doesn't use a lot of notes. Here she is describing Captain Hook's first appearance.
Hook dances at the front. He rubs his hands together and then starts as if he's fighting with a sword. He dances around the front while the other characters continue to hide. Now John and the pirates over at the bed start to sword fight. while Captain Hook continues to dance front right.
The next night, Tigner will do this for an audience, and her voice will help others access an experience they couldn't have had otherwise. I'm Michael Marks for the Texas Standard.
You're listening to a special edition of Texas Standard, the state of disability in Texas.
Support for Texas Standard comes from Texas Mutual, a workers' compensation insurance company committed to providing support to nonprofits bringing positive change to working families and Texas communities. More at texasmutual.com/community.
This is a special edition of the Texas Standard. I'm Shelley Brisbane. We're focusing today on a broad and diverse group of Texans, people who are disabled. We've heard in our program about those who are blind or visually impaired, people who use wheelchairs, and people with autism. Some disabilities are obvious to other people, others are hidden. The Invisible Disabilities Association says hidden disabilities include fatigue, pain, or cognitive dysfunction, among many others. These are some of the same symptoms people experience with long COVID. And indeed, the federal government says long COVID qualifies as a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Dr. Esther Malamed is an assistant professor in the Department of Neurology at the UT Austin Dell Medical School. She's also research director at the Post-COVID-19 program. Dr. Malamed, thanks so much for being in the Texas Standard studio with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me today.
And Dr. Monica Verduzco-Gutierrez is professor and chair in the Department of Physical and Medical Rehabilitation at UT Health San Antonio. She also developed a post-COVID-19 recovery clinic there. Dr. Verduzco-Gutierrez, thanks so much for your time.
Shelley, thank you for having me today.
Dr. Malamed, let's start with you. What is your understanding right now about how common it is to develop long COVID symptoms?
It's a little bit not understood completely. However, studies are demonstrating that at least 10 to 30% of individuals who had acute COVID go on to develop long COVID. Some studies actually cite as high as 60%.
I'm going to also add something to this about the number of people who have long COVID is these are the numbers that we have at this moment. And with people maybe only having one infection, what we don't know yet and what we are very concerned about is reinfections. And as people, COVID is around, it's endemic. It seems like it's going to have little surges every few months, every year. And what's going to happen when someone's been infected 3, 4, 5 times and how the rates of long COVID will go up with that.
Dr. Verduzco-Gutierrez, thank you so much for contributing that. Can you also talk a little bit about the kinds of symptoms that you've seen in your clinic for long COVID patients?
So there's something that I say when I talk about the symptoms and the patients that I see is that if you've seen one patient with long COVID, you've seen one patient with long COVID. And that means that there can be so many symptoms. There's one study where they looked at symptoms, over 200 symptoms that patients with long COVID had who are having lingering effects after the infection. One major thing is fatigue, but not just regular fatigue that's also called post-exertional malaise. So that means someone might be doing an activity that they were used to doing before and seems very simple, but after trying that activity, they have a crash and maybe they can't get out of bed or they're, just knocked out for 2 days. Along with that, patients can also have symptoms of POTS, which are headaches, palpitations, heart rate going up, when they're standing or doing activities. We know that patients can have pains in any parts of their body. We know that they can have migraines and severe dizziness. You name it, COVID can make it worse.
Dr. Malamed, can you talk about what we know currently about how COVID-19 affects the brain in long-term COVID cases?
So, Shelley, we're finding that among the multiple symptoms that Dr. Gutierrez mentioned, neurological symptoms are some of the most common ones that we see. And patients present with difficulty with attention, concentration, and memory, which collectively has been termed by patients as brain fog. In addition, patients develop neuropathies where they have pain in different parts of their bodies. Many of these patients go on to have documented small fiber neuropathies. And as a result of these neurological symptoms, a lot of patients feel extremely disabled. And that is one of the leading causes of why people say they may no longer be able to work.
Dr. Verduzco Gutierrez, I mentioned the ADA earlier. How have some of your patients been accessing some of the resources and benefits available via the ADA who have long COVID?
So it is nice that the ADA does recognize long COVID as a disability. So that means that as a physician, I can write accommodations for a patient who may have to work but have accommodations. So that might be asking for telework. I may ask for someone to have a gradual return to work program, see how much they can tolerate. So maybe they just start at 4 hours a day instead of going full 8 hours a day.
Dr. Melamed, have you also seen your patients use ADA resources, and has it been a struggle for them? Have folks had difficulty redefining themselves as somebody with a disability?
Yeah, Shelley, it's a really important question. And you mentioned earlier that there are a lot of disabilities that are visible. And for long COVID patients, often the disabilities are invisible. And as a result, it becomes very challenging for patients to be able to explain to their family members and to people at work that they're actually not feeling well. And I've seen people start to really redefine themselves and what's meaningful for them and who is meaningful in their lives and who is there to continue to support them with this invisible disability.
The other thing we see is stigma. There's been even research showing that these patients feel that they've had high rates of stigma and discrimination against them because of, again, as you've described, their invisible disability.
Dr. Verduzco Gutierrez, prevention is obviously the best way to avoid COVID, but what would you suggest for people who think they might be experiencing symptoms of long COVID, and what should they do, and how should they recognize it?
Definitely when someone has had COVID and they may be experiencing some of the symptoms, I definitely recommend that get to their healthcare professional. Hopefully more and more healthcare professionals are getting educated on it. We've written a set of consensus guidance statements for many of the most common symptoms related to long COVID that are available for all healthcare providers. There are at least treatments that can help some of the major symptoms related to long COVID.
Dr. Monica Verduzco Gutierrez is professor and chair in the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at UT Health San Antonio, and Dr. Esther Melamed is an assistant professor in the Department of Neurology at UT Health's Dell Medical School. Thank you both so much for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
So often, we don't know how to react to disability. It's not always clear what words we should say, what questions we should ask. Sometimes the best way forward is to listen and to learn about someone else's real-life experience. The State of Disability in Texas was produced by Sarah Ash, Alexandra Hart, Michael Marks, Gloria Martinez, and Molly Jo Tilton. Gabby Munoz, Raul Alonso, and Wells Dunbar put together the social and online elements. Leah Scarpelli was our director, and Casey Cheek was technical director. Laura Rice was our executive producer. Much of the music you heard on today's show was performed by artists with disabilities as identified by the organization RAMPed, which stands for Recording Artists and Music Professionals with Disabilities. You can learn more at rampd.org. I'm Shelley Brisbane, and I hope you'll continue to engage with us on the state of disability in Texas. We'd love to hear your stories and find out what topics you think we should dig into over the next year. Interact with us now at texasstandard.org/disability.
Philanthropic support comes from Casey and Scott O'Hare, the Winkler Family Foundation, Lynn Dobson and Greg Wooldridge, Adrian Killam, the George Huntington family, and the Hatton W. Sumners Foundation.
If you want to know what's going on in the world, then you need to know what's going on in Texas. Every weekday on the Texas Standard, we bring you stories from across the state that affect what's going on elsewhere. As part of the NPR network, an independent coalition of public media podcasters, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Michael Marks. Talk to you tomorrow.
A devastating winter storm, millions without power, hundreds dead. How could this happen in the energy capital of America?
The market was killing people in their homes, and I had lost faith in it. And every decision we made at that point forward was to get the lights on.
I'm Mose Bushell. I'll be your host for The Disconnect, Power, Politics, and the Texas Blackout. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.